Hello and welcome back to another video. Now in today's video I'm going to do a sort of discussion. I recently watched a video from Britta at The Second Shelf, and she oftentimes makes really interesting sort of videos talking about books in interesting ways, etc. As in her most recent video that I think was uploaded yesterday, or at least yesterday when I'm filming this, she was talking about the art of translation from the perspective of her as an author whose books have been translated into Dutch, and she's been going over and revising the translations just to make sure that they make sense and that they work well, they're smooth and everything. And a lot of the things that she said sort of align with my master's thesis study. So when Britta said that what she was saying wasn't like an empirical finding, it kind of makes up the body of qualitative data that can be used to create an empirical study. And one aspect of that empirical study is sort of what I produced in my master's. So kind of I just want to go through some of the points that she made and then talk about it from my perspective as somebody who researched it and has spoken to literary translators. Now, I guess the first thing to make clear is that when Britta was talking, her focus was mostly on the experience of the translator who's translated her text from English into Dutch. And so I'm guessing that the translator is a Dutch native speaker, because that's the way the translators usually work. You translate into your native language. Therefore, that kind of experience is going to be very different to what I know, because of all the translators that I interviewed and talked with and gathered data from, all of them except for one are native English speakers, so translating into English. So there's going to be a very big difference between the experience of the translators that I spoke with and what Britta experiences. This is all to do with sort of language and literary cultures that change from place to place and place to place. So for example, you have small language cultures. A prime example is Sweden. Because Swedish is only really spoken within Sweden and not really anywhere else, and you know, there's quite a small population of Swedish speakers, and a lot of the people who do speak Swedish also are quite fluent in English, so tend to read books in English if they can. So that kind of defines Swedish as a small language culture, in which the culture around the language doesn't grow as much as perhaps it does with English, because it's a massive language culture, I guess. And then you have small literary cultures, and they're going to be places like Uruguay or Paraguay, places that speak a big language, so they speak Spanish, of course, but the literary culture is much smaller than perhaps that of Spain or Mexico, you know, places that kind of have a much richer history of literature and publishing and stuff. Therefore, the publishing systems that have been created within these small literary cultures function very differently. There's probably not going to be as much money as there would be in, say, the English literary culture. There's going to be lots of different things that impact the way literature is produced within these small language cultures and small literary cultures. Therefore, there's going to be massive disparities between people working within the British industry and people working within other external industries. So that's kind of the caveat to say that this perspective is going to be very different to Britta's perspective, not only because my research comes from the translators, but also because it comes from a completely different sort of publishing industry, where there is more money, there is more work involved, and there is a kind of a longer history of Englishness around the world through literature. So I've made some notes on what Britta said in the video, and I'm just going to give an alternative perspective, because from my research, there are some things which are slightly different within the British publishing industry than what Britta has experienced. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying Britta is wrong, because no, there are multiple realities constantly existing at the same time. And it's a case of getting a bigger picture as opposed to categorizing things in different ways. So the first point that Britta made was that everybody can become a translator, that there's no qualifications necessary to become a translator. All you need to be able to do is speak another language, and you can, if you want, become a translator. Now, in theory, this is true. That is the case. But I think in practice, the reality kind of suggests otherwise. This is probably the biggest part of my thesis that I was examining about translator identities. And how do you become a translator ultimately, or how do you identify as a translator? And there is a lot of trouble, and it's a very difficult process to go through, and there are so many sort of binary oppositions, which makes it even more difficult. We have the emerging translator versus the established translator, and there's kind of no clear definitions between when you are one and when you are the other, yet they're treated in very different ways. The emerging translator is usually a young new translator who might have their first translation. There are lots of sort of prizes and funds specifically targeted for these translators to help them break into the industry and whatnot. And then you have the established translator, in which it becomes easier to get work because people know you've got a corpus of work that kind of helps to prove that you're a good translator. Yet there's also this massive grey in between space where some translators, they cannot apply for the grants that emerging translators can apply for, but yet they're still not being treated as established translators. So they kind of fall between the gaps. And you see this in the publishing industry, even for authors. You get debut authors and you get established authors, and then you get those sort of middling authors who then fade into nothingness because they're not new and exciting, but yet they haven't quite yet made it to the big thing. These sort of systems in place are very difficult to navigate for translators, and it becomes problematic in making a career out of translators. So many literary translators, particularly emerging literary translators, they can't work just as translators. They have to work in other ways. And sometimes this means that they might have to make sacrifices, or they might have to focus on other areas, which makes it even more difficult to become an established translator. Because there are a lot of people who do want to become translators, because maybe they're really bookish, they really enjoy sort of working with fiction, etc. There are systems in place which kind of mean that you have to have an education, or you have to have some sort of qualification, because how can you apply for grants, how can you get funding, how can you get that first job if you don't have something behind you to support you in working as a translator? You need to sort of prove it, and this kind of goes for the world in general. You might not need qualifications for lots of jobs, but you definitely need experience, and you definitely need to have the proof that you are capable of doing that job. And therefore with translators, there are big issues in that of all the translators that I've spoken to, it was, I would say, 95% were white middle-class translators. The majority of those had gone to renowned institutions to either learn languages with modules in translation, or to learn or to do masters in translation studies. So whilst, yes, you can become a translator without qualifications, the reality is otherwise. The fact is that in this day and age, you need to have something to support yourself to become a translator. It's not something that anybody can just kind of step into. And then, of course, we have the big issue where, because of that system, at least in the British industry, the pool of who can become a translator becomes very small, and then you kind of get homogenized voices. They're all going to be white, they're all going to be middle-class perspectives. So where Britta kind of talks about how the possibility that anybody can become a translator can have negative impacts on then the translation, I would argue that we need to actually move away from the notion that you have to have experience and whatnot, and we need to make it more democratic and more opportune for various voices to become translators, so that we can gather new insights and sort of change and mold the way that translation actually is. Because I think once you start getting different voices translating, you'll get different kinds of translation, which is really important because, particularly in the English publishing industry, translation is all about homogenization, or it's about domestication. It's about making the foreign comfortable for English readers. So in that case, I see what Britta was talking about, but then I think that I personally would at least advocate for a much more open and inclusive space in which people can become translators, or at least, can become established translators. Her next point is that translators are paid poorly and by word. Yes, that is true. In the UK, at least, things are getting slightly better. I think people are now beginning to appreciate translators for their work and for their hard work. The translators have also, I wouldn't say they've unionized, but they kind of have unionized. They've created the Translators Association as part of the Society of Authors, and the Society of Authors have really worked hard to ensure that all translators who can become part of the Society of Authors or can become part of the Emerging Translators Network, which is another separate thing. Society of Authors has worked hard to ensure that these people are educated to know that the minimum of what they should be earning is about £95 per 1,000 words, and that is what they need to be asking for in sort of job contracts and whatnot. But having that sort of protection of the Society of Authors helps to ensure that the emerging translators aren't being taken advantage of, and that doesn't affect the general ecosystem of translators. Because if emerging translators are taking far less than what they're worth, then the established translators are going to also struggle. Like it's a system in which affects everybody, and therefore they all kind of choose to fight to get a decent enough salary, and of course it can be more. Translation is really expensive because not only do you have to buy the rights and you have to buy the translation, but all the additional funds that are required for translation, it doesn't come from the British industry. It comes from like the countries that you're translating from, because hopefully they'll have grants to support their language being translated into English. It's a very desirable thing. It's like a sort of intercultural sharing of ideas and literatures and whatnot. But I feel like we need to start investing more money in the British system to support translations and translators, so that translators can get paid what they deserve to be paid, but also so that we don't have to rely on external charitable funding in order to kind of get translations into the hands. Of course, this also means that the more mainstream we make translation, the more money it can generate itself. Because of course, because as a commodity, books need to sell, and if people are still treating translation as something separate and something sort of marginal, then people are less likely going to buy it unless you have a particular interest in reading translated fiction. And then she makes the point, nobody checks the translation, which again is true in theory, but I think in practice, I guess in practice it's also true, but I do think there is a lot of pressure perhaps on translators, particularly within the British industry, because translators tend to all be friends, or literary translators all tend to be friends with each other. They know each other, they go on retreats with each other, they're constantly in conversation with other fellow translators, and they're using social media to engage. There are forums and everything that they help each other to kind of overcome difficult obstacles in the translation process. So it's not necessarily a completely solitary job in this day and age, at least, or at least in the British industry, because of that kind of close-knit community. I would also argue that most readers of translated fiction might also be translators themselves, and might also be translators who know the language and they might know the book. Because of this friendship, this community sense, there is a sort of a pressure in which the translator has to do a good job, because they know who's going to be reading the translation, because they're going to be the most likely people. We all like to support our friends. When our friends bring out a book or something, we want to go buy it, we want to support them, we want to read it, we want to talk about it, and we want to share in that moment. Therefore, if a lot of your friends are also translators who might know the same languages as you, there is this underlying pressure that they're going to make judgments on your ability as a translator based on their perception of how you've translated the work. It's like, that's a very sort of a hidden social pressure. That's not like an actual, somebody's going to go through and check and whatnot. But then also you have the issue that editors do edit translation. And there's so many issues with this, because if a book comes from a small literary culture, the chances are that it hasn't actually been edited within that culture before it's been published. Because of the way publishing industries work, it varies from different places. Different places have different sort of modes of publishing, so they have different expectations of what a book is, what a novel looks like, how a novel is shaped and everything. So when these are then translated into English, sometimes they just don't work in the English market, and an editor has to go through and make big changes, big structural changes. They do this with the permission of the author. The translator sometimes mediates between the two. For example, I spoke to an editor and they gave an example of where they had to make some changes to characters' genders and whatnot because it became too misogynist. I was also speaking to a translator who was saying that they had to make really big structural edits. This wasn't the translator's job, this was the editor's job. They had to make big structural edits because the book was sold as a romance, and yet the romance didn't take place until like the last 50 pages. So they had to kind of really rearrange and change the entire structure of the text to make it a romance novel in the English market and how English people perceive romance novels to be. And editors also mediate language so much, which I find quite disheartening, because translators might have one choice of how to then sort of, translate a specific word or a phrase. There are some Scottish translators who might use Scots slang because it enriches the text, and particularly if they're translated from Scandinavian languages, sometimes it makes sense, but then editors will cut that out and put in proper English. And also editors will choose to sort of neutralize the English because chances are this translation is going to be sold globally, so it can't be too British, it can't be too American, it can't be too Australian, it has to be a very neutral English. Therefore, sometimes decisions that get put into the translation aren't actually necessarily what the translator has decided. That's going to be what the editor has decided to ensure that the text works within the English market. So whilst it's not being double checked for the translation, it is being double checked for the flow of English, and therefore some of the decisions that are made might not necessarily have been the translator's decision. And translators can fight on specific edits. They can argue for why it needs to remain, but the chances are high that they might not win because editors tend to have like a little bit more power. The point of translation in the British industry is to make the translator as invisible as possible. They want the translation to be fluent. Therefore, they want the reader to kind of feel as if they're reading directly from the original author. So obviously the editors play a role in this, and that kind of adds another layer which can cause problems in translation, or can, allow mistranslations or allow big changes that the author might not be happy with, and sometimes the author might not know, but most of the time the author tends to be happy because, as the editor that I interviewed said, it's sort of like a privilege to be translated into English. Lots of people want it because that's how they can make money, because to be translated into English is like the ideal due to English being such a global literary culture, which is sad, I think. So then Britta also talked about how the Booker Prize, the International Booker Prize, how can the judges talk about the translation or judge the translation based on without having read the original text? And this poses a really interesting philosophical question. It poses what makes a good translation, what makes a bad translation, how can we judge translation if we haven't read the original? And Britta did also say that translation she perceives to be an art, and I also agree with that notion. Translation is an art, and the translators are sort of wordsmiths in themselves. They are like writers. They're just doing a different kind of writing, and they have to be creative. They have to use their imagination. They have to really develop the text and play with it in a way that is artistic and creating an artistic object. So then you have to wonder as to sort of the ownership of translation. A book in translation, does that belong to the translator or does that belong to the original author? This kind of helps to play a role in defining a translator and their value. And of course, the British industry would prefer to argue that the translation belongs to the original author because it's their sort of original idea and whatnot. So then also, because it is like this sort of art form, and I'm personally on the side that it belongs to the translator because they've poured hours of their soul into this work, and it is, of their interpretation of the original text. No translation looks the same. If you get 5 translators translating the same book, they're all going to be completely different. They're all going to have focused on different aspects of the original. They're all going to have brought in different themes through the words and the way they've chosen to. Therefore, it becomes an object of interpretation, and it becomes so much more difficult to then say this is a good translation versus this is a bad translation. Because even if you can read the original text, when you read the original text, you're creating your own interpretation of that text. Therefore, when you judge the translation, you're judging it based on your interpretation, but the translator might have had a different interpretation. Therefore, some people might say it's a good translation, whereas other people might say it's a bad translation. Therefore, there's no such thing as a good or bad translation. A translation is just a translation. I think some of the examples that Britta gave are kind of fair examples of really mundane, logistical mistranslations. But the interpretive power of translation sort of redefines how we need to assess it. So yes, those are some of my thoughts on the things that she said. I feel like I could say more. I will also post a link to my master's thesis in case you're interested. I don't know why you would be interested. Just be aware that it's a master's thesis, it's designed for university, and I do some experimental ethnography in it. So it might not be your cup of tea, but I'll post it anyway in case you are interested. And I'm trying to think, I feel like I could talk about this for a long time. It's such an interesting topic, and I'm glad that Britta started talking about it and to get me engaged in the conversation because you know, I do find it as fascinating as she does, and I find it as fascinating that there are so many different perspectives around the art of translation that can be different and can coexist and whatnot. So yeah, so thank you, Britta, for making your video, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts about the art of translation and how you perceive translation and how you interpret the sort of value of translation. Leave all the comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you soon for another video. Bye bye.